Theme 4: Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings. Cultural Developments 600 BC to 600 CE. A sculpture from Sachi. In this chapter, we shall go on a long journey across 1,000 years to read about philosophers and their attempts to understand the world they inhabited. We will also see how their ideas were compiled as oral and written text, as well as expressed in architecture and sculpture. These are indicative of the enduring influence these thinkers had on people. While we will be focusing on Buddhism, it is important to remember that this tradition did not develop in isolation. There were several other traditions each engaged in debates and dialogues with the others. The sources that historians use to reconstruct this exciting world of ideas and beliefs include Buddhist, Jaina, and Brahmanical texts, as well as a large and impressive body of material remains including monuments and inscriptions. Among the best preserved monuments of the time is the Stupa at Sachi, which is a major focus in this chapter. Shahjahan Begum. A glimpse of Sachi. Sachi in the 19th century. The most wonderful ancient buildings in the state of Bhopal are at Sachi, Kanakheda, a small village under the brow of a hill some 20 miles northeast of Bhopal, which we visited yesterday. We inspected the stone sculptures and statues of Buddha and an ancient gateway. The ruins appeared to be the object of great interest to European gentlemen. Major Alexander Cunningham stayed several weeks in this neighborhood and examined these ruins most carefully. He took drawing of the place, deciphered the inscription, and both sap down these domes. The result of his investigations were described by him in an English work. From Shahjahan Begum, Nawab of Bhopal, ruled 1868 to 1901. Tajul Iqbal Tariq Bhopal, A History of Bhopal, translated by H.D. Barstow, 1876. 19th century Europeans were very interested in the stupa at Sachi. In fact, the French sought Shahjahan Begum's permissions to take away the eastern gateway, which was the best preserved, to be displayed in a museum in France. For a while, some Englishmen also wanted to do the same, but fortunately both the French and the English were satisfied with carefully prepared plaster cast copies, and the original remained at the site, part of the Bhopal state. The rulers of Bhopal, Shahjahan Begum and her successor Sultan Jehan Begum, provide money for the preservation of the ancient site. No wonder then that John Marshall dedicated his important volume of Sachi to Sultan Jehan. She founded the museum that was built there, as well as the guest house where he lived and wrote the volumes. She also funded the publication of the volume. So if the stupa complex has survived, it is in no small measure due to wise decision and to good luck in escaping the eyes of railways contractors, builders, and those looking for finds to carry away to the museums of Europe. One of the most important Buddhist centers, the discovery of Sachi, has vastly transformed our understanding of early Buddhism. Today it stands testimony to the successful restoration and preservation of a key archaeological site by the Archaeological Survey of India. The great stupa at Sachi. If you travel from Delhi to Bhopal by train, you will see the majestic stupa complex on top of a hill, crowning it as it were. If you request the guard, he will stop the train at the little station of Sachi for 2 minutes, enough time for you to get down. As you climbed up the hill, you can see the complex of structures, a large mound, and other monuments, including a temple built in the 5th century. Discuss, compare what Shahjahan Begum describe with what you see in figure 4.3. What similarities and differences do you notice? Comment this. But what is the significance of this monument? Why was the mound built and what did it contain? Why is there a stone railing around it? Who built the complex or paid for its construction? When was it discovered? There is a fascinating story that we can uncover at Sachi, for which we must combine information from a text, sculpture, architecture, and inscription. Let us begin by exploring the background of the early Buddhist tradition. A prayer to Agni. Here are two verses from the Rig Veda invoking Agni, the god of fire, often identified with the sacrifice of fire, into which offerings were made so as to reach the other deities. Bring, O strong one, this sacrifice of powers to the gods. O wise one, as a liberal giver, bestow on us, O priest, abundant food, Agni, obtained by sacrificing mighty wealth for us. Procure, Agni, forever to him who prays to you the gift of nourishment. The wonderful cow may soon be ours, offspring that continues our line. Verses such as these were composed in a special kind of Sanskrit. They were taught orally to men belonging to priestly families. Leave the objective of the sacrifice. Comment this. 2. The background, sacrifices, and devotees. The mid-1st millennium BCE is often regarded as a turning point in world history. It saw the emergence of thinkers such as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongji in China, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle in Greece, and Mahavira, Gautam Buddha, among many others in India. They tried to understand the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. This was also the time when new kingdoms and cities were developing and social and economic life was changing in a variety of ways in the Ganga Valley. Chapter 2 and 3. These thinkers attempted to understand these developments as well. The sacrificial tradition. There were several pre-existing traditions of thought, religious belief and practice, including the early Vedic tradition known from the Rig Veda, compiled between 1500 and 1000 BC. The Rig Veda consists of hymns in praise of a variety of deities, especially Agni, Indra and Soma. Many of these hymns are chanted when sacrifices were performed, where people prayed for cattle, son, good health, long life, etc. At first, sacrifices were performed collectively. Later, see 1000 BC to 500 BC onwards, some were performed by the heads of household for the well-being of the domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices such as the Rajashua and Ashwamedha were performed by chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmana priests to conduct the ritual. New questions. Many ideas found in the Upanishad, 6th century BC onward, show that people were curious about the meaning of life. the possibility of life after death, and rebirth. Was rebirth due to past actions? Such issues were hotly debated. Thinkers were concerned with understanding and expressing the nature of the ultimate reality. Another, outside the Vedic tradition, asked whether or not there even was a single ultimate reality. People also began speculating on the significance of the sacrificial tradition. Debates and discussions. We get a glimpse of lively discussions and debates from Buddhist texts, which mention as many as 64 sects or school of thoughts. Teachers travel from place to place trying to convince one another as well as layperson about the validity of their philosophy or the way they understood the world. Debates took place in the Krutagroshala, literally a hut with a pointed roof, or in groups where traveling mendicants halted. If a philosopher succeeded in convincing one of his rivals, the followers of the latter also became his disciples. So support for any particular sect could grow and shrink over time. Many of these teachers, including Mahavira and the Buddha, questioned the authority of the Vedas. They also emphasized individual agency, suggesting the man and woman could strive to attain liberation from the trials and tribulations of worldly existence. This was in marked contrast to the Brahmanical position wherein, as we have seen, an individual's existence was thought to be determined by his or her birth in a specific caste or gender. Verses from the Upanishads. Here are two verses from the Chandogya Upanishad, a text composed in Sanskrit 6th century BC. The nature of the self. This self of mine within the heart is smaller than paddy or barley or mustard or millet or the kernel of a seed of millet. The self of mine within the heart is greater than the earth, greater than the intermediate space, greater than heaven, greater than these worlds. The true sacrifice. This one, the wind that blows, this is surely a sacrifice. While moving, it sanctifies all this. Therefore, it is indeed a sacrifice. How Buddhist texts were prepared and preserved. The Buddha and other teachers taught orally, through discussion and debate. Men and women, perhaps children as well, attended this discourse and discussed what they heard. None of the Buddha's speech was written down during his lifetime. After his death, 5th-4th century BC, his teaching was compiled by his disciples at a council of elders or senior monks at Basil. Pali for Vaishali in present-day Bihar. These compilations were known as Tipitaka, literally 3 baskets to hold different types of text. They were first transmitted orally and then written and classified according to length as well as subject matter. The Vinaya Pitaka included rule and regulation for those who joined the Sangha or monastic order. The Buddhist teaching was included in the Sutta Pitaka. And the Abhidhamma Pitaka dealt with philosophical matters. Each Pitaka comprised a number of individual texts. Later commentaries were written on this text by Buddhist scholars. As Buddhism traveled to new regions such as Sri Lanka, other texts such as the Dipavamsa, literally the Chronicle of the Iceland, and the Mahavamsa, the Great Chronicles, were written containing regional histories of Buddhism. Many of these works contain biographies of the Buddha. Some of the oldest texts are in Pali, while later compositions are in Sanskrit. When Buddhism spread to Asia, East Asia, pilgrims such as Fa Hien and Xuanzang traveled all the way from China to India in search of texts. These there took back to their own country, where they were translated by scholars. Indian Buddhist teachers also traveled to faraway places, carrying texts to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhist texts were preserved in manuscript for several centuries in monasteries in different parts of Asia. Modern translations have been prepared from Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan texts. A Buddhist manuscript in Sanskrit, 12th century. Fatalist and Materialist. Here is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka describing a conversation between King Ajatashattu, the ruler of the Magadha, and the Buddha. On one occasion, King Ajatashattu visited the Buddha and described what another teacher named Makkali Goshala had told him. Though the wise should hope, by this virtue, by this penance I will gain karma, and the fool should by the same mean hope to gradually rid himself of his karma. Neither of them can do it. Pleasure and pain, measured out as it were, cannot be altered in the course of samsara, transmigration. It can neither be lessened or increased, just as a ball of string will, when thrown, unwind to its full length, so fool and wise alike will take their courses and make an end of sorrow. And this is what a philosopher named Ajita Keshakambalin thought. There is no such thing, O king, as alms of sacrifice or offerings. There is no such thing as this world or the next. A human being is made up of the four elements. When he dies, the earth in him returns to the earth, the fluid to water, the heart to fire, the wind to air, and his senses passes into space. The talk of gifts is the doctrine of fool and empty lie. Fools and wise alike are cut off and perish. They do not survive after death. The first teacher belonged to the tradition of the Ajivikas. They have often been described as fatalists, those who believe that everything is predetermined. The second teacher belonged to the tradition of the Lokajatas, usually described as materialist. Texts from this tradition have not survived, so we know about them only from the works of other traditions. Do you think it is appropriate to describe this man as fatalist or materialist? Comment this. Discuss what are the problems in reconstructing histories of ideas and belief when texts are not available or have not survived? Comment this. Next 3. Beyond worldly pleasures, the message of Mahavira. An image of a Tirthankara from the Mathura, 3rd century CE. The basic philosophy of the Jainas was already in existence in North India before the birth of Vardhamana, who came to be known as Mahavira. In the 6th century BC, according to Jaina tradition, Mahavira was preceded by 23 other teachers or Tirthankaras, literally those who guide men and women across the river of existence. The most important idea in Jainism is that the entire world is animated. Even stone, rocks, and water have life. Non-injury to living beings, especially to humans, animals, plants, and insects, is central to Jaina philosophy. In fact, the principle of ahimsa, emphasized within Jainism, has left its mark on Indian thinking as a whole. According to Jaina teaching, the cycle of birth and rebirth is shaped through karma. Asceticism and penance are required to free oneself from the cycle of karma. This can be achieved only by renouncing the world. Therefore, monastic existence is a necessary condition of salvation. Jaina monks and nuns took 5 vows to abstain from killing, stealing, and lying, to observe celibacy, and to abstain from possessing property. The world behind the palace. Just as the Buddha's teachings were compiled by his followers, the teachings of Mahavira were also recorded by his disciples. These were often in the form of stories, which could appeal to ordinary people. Here is one example from a Prakrit text known as the Uttaradhyana Sutta, describing how a queen named Kamalavati tried to persuade her husband to renounce the world. If the whole world and all its treasure were yours, you would not be satisfied, nor would all this be able to save you when you die, O king, and leave all things behind. Dhamma alone and nothing else will save you. As a bird dislikes the cage, so do I dislike the world. I shall live as a nun without offspring, without desire, without the love of gain, and without hatred. Those who have enjoyed pleasure and renounce them move about like the wild and go wherever they please, unchecked like birds in their flight. Live your large kingdom, abandon what pleases the senses. Be without attachment and property, then practice ever penance, being form of energy. Which of the arguments advanced by the queen do you find most convincing? Comment this. Discuss, is ahimsa relevant in the 21st century? Comment this. The spread of Jainism. Gradually, Jainism spread to many parts of India. Like the Buddhist, Jaina scholars produced a wealth of literature in a variety of languages: Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Tamil. For centuries, manuscripts of these texts were carefully preserved in libraries attached to temples. Some of the earliest stone sculptures associated with religious tradition were produced by devotees of the Jaina Tirthankaras and have been recovered from several sites throughout the subcontinent. A page from a 14th century Jaina manuscript. Can you identify the script? Comment this. The Buddha and the Quest for Enlightenment. One of the most influential teachers of the time was the Buddha. Over the countries, his message spread across the subcontinent and beyond through the Central Asia to China, Korea, Japan, and through Sri Lanka, across the seas to Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia. How do we know about Buddha's teaching? These have been reconstructed by carefully editing, translating, and analyzing the Buddhist text mentioned earlier. Historians have also tried to reconstruct details of his life from hagiographics. Many of these were written down at least a century after the time of Buddha in an attempt to preserve memories of the great teacher. Hagiography is a biography of a saint or a religious leader. Hagiographies often praise the saint's achievement and may not always be literally accurate. They were important because they tell us about the beliefs of the followers of the particular tradition. According to this tradition, Siddhartha, as the Buddha was named at birth, was the son of a chief of the Shakya clan. He had a sheltered upbringing within the palace, insulted from the harsh realities of life. One day, he persuaded his charioteer to take him into the city. His first journey into the world outside was traumatic. He was deeply anguished when he saw an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. He realized in that moment that the decay and destruction of the human body was inevitable. He also saw a homeless mendicant who, it seemed to him, had come to terms with old age, disease, and death, and found peace. Siddhartha decided that he too would adopt the same path. Soon after, he left the palace and set out in search of his own truth. Siddhartha explored several paths, including bodily mortification, which led him to a situation of near death. Abandoning these extreme methods, he meditated for several years and finally attained enlightenment. After this, he came to be known as the Buddha, or the Enlightened One. For the rest of his life, he taught Dhamma, or the path of religious living. A sculpture from Amravati, Andhra Pradesh, depicting the departure of the Buddha from his palace. Discuss. If you didn't know about the life of the Buddha, would you be able to tell what the sculpture depicts? Comment this. 5. The teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha's teachings have been reconstructed from stories found mainly in the Sutta Pitaka. Although some stories describe his miraculous power, others suggest that the Buddha tried to convince people through reason and persuasions rather than through display of supernatural power. For instance, when a grief-stricken woman whose child had died came to the Buddha, he gently convinced her about the inevitability of death rather than bring her son back to life. These stories were narrated in the language spoken by ordinary people so that this could be easily understood. According to Buddha's philosophy, the world is transient, anicca, and constantly changing. It is also soulless, anatta, as there is nothing permanent or eternal in it. Within this transient world, sorrow, dukkha, is intrinsic to human existence. It is by following the path of moderation between severe penance and self-indulgence that human beings can rise above these worldly troubles. In the earliest form of Buddhism, where or not God existed were irrelevant. Buddhism in practice. This is an excerpt from Sutta Pitaka and contains the advice given by the Buddha to a wealthy householder named Sigala. In 5 ways should a master look after his servant and employees: by assigning them work according to their strength, by supplying them with food and wages, by tending them in sickness, by sharing delicacies with them, and by granting leave at times. In 5 ways should the clansman look after the needs of samanas, those who have renounced the world, and brahmanas: by affection in act and speech and mind, by keeping open house to them and supplying their worldly needs. There are similar instructions to Sigala about how to behave with his parents, teachers, and wife. Suggest what the instruction regarding parents, teachers, and wife may have been. Comment this. Discuss. Compare the Buddha's advice to Sigala with Ashoka's advice to his subjects. Do you notice any similarities and differences? Comment this. The Buddha regarded the social world as the creations of human rather than of divine origin. Therefore, he advised kings and grahapratis to be human and ethical. Individual effort was expected to transform social relations. The Buddha emphasized individual agencies and righteous action as the means to escape from the cycle of rebirth and attain self-realization and nibbana. Literally, the extinguishing of the ego and desire, and thus end the cycle suffering for those who renounce the world. According to Buddhist tradition, his last word to his followers were, "Be lambs unto yourselves, as all of you must work out your own liberation." 6. Followers of the Buddha. Soon they grew a body of disciples of the Buddha, and he founded a Sangha, an organization of monks who became teachers of Dhamma. These monks lived simply, possessing only the essential requisites for survival, such as a bowl to receive food once a day from the laity. As they lived on alms, they were known as bhikkhus. Initially, only men were allowed into the Sangha, but later women also came to be admitted, according to Buddhist text. This was made possible through the meditation of Ananda, one of the Buddha's dearest disciples, who persuaded him to allow women into the Sangha. The Buddha's foster mother, Mahaprajapati Gautami, was the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni. Many women who entered the Sangha became teachers of Dhamma and went on to become theris, or respected women who had attained liberation. The Buddha's followers came from many social groups. They included kings, wealthy men, and grahapratis, and also humbler folks, workers, slaves, and craftspeople. Once within the Sangha, all were regarded as equal, having shared their earlier social identities on becoming bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. The internal functioning of the Sangha was based on the tradition of Ganas and Sangha, where consensus was arrived as through discussions. If that failed, decisions were taken by a vote on the subject. A woman water carrier, Mathura, 3rd century. The Therighata, the unique Buddhist text, part of the Sutta Pitaka, is a collection of verses composed by bhikkhunis. It provides an insight into women's social and spiritual experience. Punna, a dashi or slave woman, went to the river each morning to fetch water for her master's household. There she would daily see a Brahmana performing bathing rituals. One morning she spoke to him. The following are verses composed by Purna, recording her conversion with the Brahmana. I am a water carrier, even in the cold. I have always gone down to the water, frightened of punishment or the angry words of high-class women. So what are you afraid of, Brahmana, that makes you go down to the water, so your limbs shake with the bitter cold? The Brahmana replied, I am doing good to prevent evil. Anyone young or old who has done something bad is freed by washing in water. Purna said, whoever told you? You are freed from evil by washing in the water? In that case, all the frogs and turtles would go to heaven, and so would the water snakes and crocodiles. Instead, don't do that things, the fear of which leads you to the water. Stop now, Brahmana. Save your skin from the cold. Which of the teachings of the Buddha are evident in the compositions? Comment this. Rules for monks and nuns. There are some of rules laid down in Vinaya Pitaka. When a new felt, blanket or rug has been made by a bhikkhu, it is to be kept for at least 6 years. If after less than 6 years he should have another new felt, blanket or rug made, regardless of whether or not he has disposed of the first, then unless he has been authorized by the bhikkhus, it is to be fortified and confessed. In case a bhikkhu arriving at a family residence is present with cakes or cooked grain meals, he may accept 2 or 3 bowlfuls if he so desires. If he should accept more than that, it is to be confessed. Having accepted the 2 or 3 bowlfuls and having taken them from there, he is to share them among the bhikkhus. This is the proper course here. Should any bhikkhu having set out bedding in a lodging belonging to the Sangha, or having had it set out, and then on departing neither put it away nor have it put away, or should he go without taking leave, it is to be confessed. Can you explain why these rules are framed? Comment this. Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime of the Buddha and after his death. As it appealed to many people dissatisfied with the existing religious practice and confused by the rapid social changes taking place around them, the importance attached to conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth, the emphasis placed on metta, fellow feeling, and karuna, compassion, especially for those who are younger and weaker than oneself, were ideas that drew men and women the Buddhist teaching. Discuss. Why do you think a dashi like Purna wanted to join the Sangha? Comment this. 7. Stupas. We have seen the Buddhist ideas and practices emerged out of the process of dialogue with other traditions, including those of the Brahmanas, Jainas, and several others. Not all of those whose ideas and practices was preserved in text. Some of these interactions can be seen in the ways in which sacred places come to be identified. From earliest time, people tended to regard certain places as sacred. This included sites with special trees or unique rocks, or sites of awe-inspiring natural beauty. The sites with small shrines attached to them were sometimes described as chaitas. Chaita may also have been derived from the word chita, meaning a funeral pyre, and by extension a funerary mound. Buddhist literature mentions several chaitas. It also describes places associated with the Buddha's life, where he was born Lumbini, where he attained enlightenment Bodhgaya, where he gave his first sermon Sarnath, and where he attained Nibbana Kushinagara. Gradually, each of these places came to be regarded as sacred. We know that about 200 years after the time of the Buddha, Ashoka erected a pillar at Lumbini to mark the fact that he had visited the place. Map 1 Major Buddhist sites: Indus, Ganga, Jamuna, Saraswati, Sarvasti, Lumbini, Kushinagara, Sarnath, Barut, Barabar, Bodhgaya, Mahanadi, Sachi, Narmada, Ajanta, Nasik, Jurnar, Karli, Nagarjunkonda, Godavari, Amravati, Krishna. Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, Krishna. Why were stupas built? This is an excerpt from the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, part of the Sutta Pitaka. As the Buddha lay dying, Ananda asked him, "What are we do to Lord with the remains of the Tathagata," another name of the Buddha? The Buddha replied, "Hinder not yourself, Ananda, by honoring the remain of the Tathagata. Be jealous, be intent on your own good." But when praised further, the Buddha said, "At the four crossroads they should erect a thupa, Pali for stupa, to the Tathagata, and whosoever shall there place garlands or perfume, or make a salutation there, or become in its presence calm of heart, that shall long be to them for a profit and joy." Look figure 4.15 and see whether you can identify some of this practice. Comment this. Why were stupas built? There were other places too that were regarded as sacred. This was because relics of the Buddha, such as his bodily remains or objects used by him, were buried there. These were mounds known as stupas. The tradition of erecting stupas may have been pre-Buddhist, but they came to be associated with Buddhism. Since they contained relics regarded as sacred, the entire stupa came to be venerated as an emblem of both the Buddha and Buddhism. According to the Buddhist text known as the Ashoka Vadana, Ashoka distributed portion of the Buddha's relics to every important towns and ordered the construction of stupas over them. By the 2nd century BCE, a number of stupas, including those at Bharut, Sachi, and Sarnath, had been built. How were stupas built? Inscriptions found on the railing and pillar of stupas record donations made for building and decorating them. Some donations were made by kings, such as the Satvahanas. Others were made by guilds, such as that of the ivory workers who financed part of one of the gateways at Sachi. Hundreds of donations were made by women and men who mentioned their names, sometimes adding the name of the place from where they come, as well as their occupation and names of their relatives. Bhikkhus and bhikkhunis also contributed toward building these monuments. The structure of the stupa. The stupa, a Sanskrit word meaning a heap, originated as a simple semicircular mound of earth, later called anda. Gradually, it evolved into a more complex structure, balancing round and square shape. Above the anda was the harmika, a balcony-like structure that represented the abode of the gods. A votive inscription from Sachi. Hundreds of similar inscriptions have also been found at Bharut and Amravati. arising from the Dharmika was a must called the Yasti, often surmounted by the chhatri or umbrella. Around the mound was railing, separating the sacred space from the secular world. Discuss. What are the similarities and differences between the plan of the great stupa, Sachi, and the photograph? Comment this. The early stupas at Sachi and Bharat were plain except for the stone railing which resembled a bamboo or wooden fence, and the gateways which were richly carved and installed at the four cardinal points. Worshippers entered through the eastern gateway and walked around the mound in a clockwise direction, keeping the mound on the right, imitating the sun's course through the sky. Later, the mound of the stupas came to be elaborately carved with niches and sculpture as at Amravati and Shahaji Ki Dheri in Peshawar, Pakistan. What are the features of the building that are clearest in plan? What are the features that are best seen in the elevation? Comment this. Plan of the great stupa of Sachi. A plan provides a horizontal perspective of a building. An elevation of the great stupa. An elevation provides a vertical perspective. Eight, discovering stupas, a fate of Amravati and Sachi. Each stupa has a history of its own, as we have just seen. Some of these are histories of how they were built, but there are histories of discoveries as well, and let us now turn to some of these. In 1796, a local Raja who wanted to build a temple stumbled upon the ruins of the stupa at Amravati. He decided to use the stone and thought there might be some treasure buried in what seemed to be a hill. Some years later, a British official named Colin Mackenzie visited the site, although he found several pieces of sculpture and never published. The eastern gateway, Sachi noticed the vibrant sculpture. In 1854, Walter Elliot, the commissioner of Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, visited Amravati and collected several sculpture panels and took them away to Madras. This came to be called the Elliot Marvels after him. He also discovered the remains of the Western Gateway and came to the conclusion that the structures at Amravati was one of the largest and most magnificent Buddhist stupas ever built. By the 1850s, some of the slabs from Amravati had begun to be taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta, to the India office in Madras, and some even to London. It was not unusual to find these sculptures adorning the gardens of British administrators. In fact, any new official in the area continued to remove sculptures from the site on the grounds that earlier officials had done the same. One of the few men who had a different point of view was an archaeologist named H. Coley. He wrote, "It seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art. He believed that museums should have plaster cast facsimiles of sculpture, whereas the original should remain." Discuss. Read section 1 again. Give your reason why Sachi survived. Comment this. In situ means on the spot, where they had been found. Unfortunately, Cole did not succeeded in convincing the authorities about Amravati, although his plea for in situ preservation was adopted in the case of Sachi. Why did Sachi survive while Amravati did not? Perhaps Amravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the finds and realized how critical it was to preserve things where they had been found instead of removing them from the site. When Sachi was discovered in 1818, three of its four gateways were still standing. The fourth was lying on the spot where it had fallen and the mound was in good condition. Even so, it was suggested that the gateway to taken to either Paris or London. Finally, a number of factors helped to keep Sachi as it was, and so it stands, whereas the Mahachaita at Amravati is now just an insignificant little mound totally denuded of its former glory. A section of the gateway. Do you think the sculpture at Sachi wanted to depict a scroll being unfurled? Nine, sculpture. We have just seen how sculptures were removed from stupas and transported all the way to Europe. This happened partly because those who saw them considered them to be beautiful and valuable and wanted to keep them for themselves. Let us look at some of these more closely. Stories in stone. You may have seen wandering storytellers carrying scroll Charanachittas of cloth or paper with pictures on them and pointing to the picture as they tell the story. Look at the figure 4.13. At first sight, the sculpture seems to depict a rural scene with thatched huts and trees. However, art historians who have carefully studied the sculpture and Sachi identify it as a scene from the Besantara Jataka. This is a story about a generous prince who gave away everything to a Brahmana and went to live in the forest with his wife and children. As you can see in this case, historians often try to understand the meaning of sculpture by comparing it with textual evidence. A part of the northern gateway. Figure 4.4, far right, worshipping the Bodhi tree. Notice the tree, the seat and the people around it. Middle right, worshipping the stupa, and below, setting in motion the wheel of dharma. Symbols of worship. Art historians had to acquire familiarity with hagiographs of the Buddha in order to understand Buddhist sculpture. According to hagiographics, the Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree. Many early sculptures did not show the Buddha in human form. Instead, they showed his presence through symbols. The empty seat was meant to indicate the meditation of the Buddha, and the stupa was meant to represent the Mahapari Nirvana. Another frequently used symbol was the wheel. This stood for the first sermon of the Buddha, delivered as Charnat. As is obvious, such sculptures cannot be understood literally. For instance, the tree does not stand. simply for a tree but symbolizes an event in the life of the Buddha. In order to understand such symbol, historians have to familiarize themselves with the tradition of those who produced these works of art. The woman at the gate. Popular traditions. Others captured as Shachi were perhaps not directly inspired by Buddhist ideas. This includes beautiful woman swinging from the edge of the gateway, holding onto a tree. Initially, scholars were a bit intrigued about this image, which seemed to have little to do with renunciation. However, after examining other literary traditions, they realized that it could be a representation of what is described in Sanskrit as Salavanjika. According to popular belief, this was a woman whose touch caused trees to flower and bear fruit. It is likely that this was regarded as an auspicious symbol and integrated into the decoration of the stupa. The Shalavanjika motif suggests that many people who turned to Buddhism enriched it with their own pre-Buddhist and even non-Buddhist beliefs, practices and ideas. Some of the recurrent motifs in the sculpture at Sachi were evidently derived from this tradition. An elephant at Sachi. There are other images as well. For instance, some of the finest depictions of animals are found there. These animals include elephant, horses, monkeys, and cattle. While the Jatakas contain several animal stories that are depicted at Sachi, it is likely that many of these animals were carved to create lively scenes to draw viewers. Also, animals were often used to symbols of human attributes. Elephants, for example, were depicted signify of strength and wisdom. Gajalakshmi, painting from the past. While stone sculpture survives the relevance of time and is therefore most easily available to the historian, other visual means of communication, including painting, were also used in the past. Those that have survived best are on walls of caves, of which those from Ajanta, Maharashtra, are the most famous. The paintings and Ajanta depict stories from the Jatakas. These include depiction of country life, procession, men and women at work, and festival. The artists use the technique of shading to give a three-dimensional quality. Some of paintings are extremely naturalistic. A painting from Ajanta note the seated figure and those serving him. A serpent at Sachi. Another motif is that of woman surrounded by lotuses and elephants, which seems to be sprinkling waters on her as if performing an abhisheka or consecration. While some historians identify the figure as Maya, the mother of the Buddha, others identify her with the popular goddess Gajalakshmi, literally, the goddess of good fortune, who is associated with elephants. It is also possible that devotees who saw this sculpture identified the figure with both Maya and Gajalakshmi. Consider too the serpent which is found on several pillars. This motif seems to be derived from popular tradition, which were not always recorded in text. Interestingly, one of the earliest modern art historians, James Ferguson, considered Sachi to be a center of tree and serpent worship. He was not familiar with Buddhist literature, most of which had not yet been translated, and arrived at this conclusion by studying only the image on their own. Discuss bone, terracotta, and metal can also be used for sculpture. Find out more about this. Comment this. 10. New religious tradition. The development of Mahayana Buddhism. By the 4th century CE, there is evidence of changes in Buddhist ideas and practices. Early Buddhist teaching had given great importance to self-effort to achieving Nibbana. Besides, the Buddha was regarded as a human being who attained enlightenment and Nibbana through his own efforts. However, gradually the idea of a savior emerged. It was believed that he was the one who could ensure salvation. Simultaneously, the concept of bodhisattva also developed. Bodhisattvas were perceived as deeply compassionate beings who accumulated merit through their effort but used this not to attain Nibbana and thereby abandon the world, but to help others. The worships of image of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became an important part of this tradition. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana, literally the great vehicle. Those who adopted these beliefs describe the older tradition as Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle. An image of Buddha from Mathura, 1st century. Hinayana or Theravada. Supporters of Mahayana regarded other Buddhists as followers of Hinayana. However, followers of the older tradition describe themselves as Theravadins. That is, those who followed the path of old, respect teachers, the Theras. The growth of Puranic Hinduism. The notion of savior was not unique to Buddhism. We find similar ideas being developed in different ways within tradition that we now consider part of Hinduism. This included Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as the principal deity, and Shaivism, the tradition within which Shiva was regarded as the chief god, in which there was growing emphasis on the worship of a chosen deity. In such worship, the bond between the devotee and the god was visualized as one of love and devotion or bhakti. The Baraho or boar avatar of Vishnu rescuing the earth goddess, Aihal, Karnataka, 6th century. What does the proportion of the figure suggest? Comment this. In the case of Vaishnavism, cult developed around the various avatars of incarnations of the deity. 10 avatars were recognized within the tradition. They were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whatever it was threatened by disorder and destruction because of the dominance of evil forces. It is likely that different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Recognizing each of these local deities as a form of the Vishnu was one way of creating a more unified religious tradition. Some of these forms were represented in sculpture, as were other deities. Shiva, for instance, was symbolized by the linga, although he was occasionally represented in human form too. All such representatives depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities and their attributes through symbols such as headdresses ornaments and ayudhas. Weapon or auspicious objects the deities hold in their hands, how they are seated, etc. They understand the meanings of the sculpture historians. An image of Durga, Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu, 6th century. Have to be familiar with stories behind them, many of which are contained in the Puranas compiled by Brahmanas. By about the middle of the first millennium CE, they contain much that had been composed and been in circulation for centuries, including stories about gods and goddesses. Generally, they were written in simple Sanskrit verse and were meant to be read aloud to everybody, including women and Sudras who did not have access to Vedic learning. Much of what is contained in Puranas evolved through interaction amongst people, priests, merchants, and ordinary men and women who travel from place to place sharing ideas and beliefs. We know, for instance, that Vasudeva Krishna was an important deity in the Mathura region. Over centuries, his worship spread to other parts of the country as well. Identify the ways in which the artists have depicted movement. Find out more about the story depicted in these sculptures. Building temples. Around the time that the stupas at sites such as Sachi was acquiring their present form, the first temple to house images of gods and goddesses were also being built. The early temple was a small square room called the Garbhagriha, which with a single doorway for the worshippers to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure known as the Shikhara was built over the central shrine. Temple walls were often decorated with sculpture. Later temples became far more elaborate with assembly halls, huge halls and gateway and arrangement for supplying waters. A temple of Deoghar, Uttar Pradesh, 5th century. Identify the remains of the Shikhara and the entrance to the Garbhagriha. Comment this. One of unique feature of the early temple was that some of these were hollowed out of huge rocks as artificial caves. The tradition of building artificial caves was an old one, some of the earliest. Vishnu reclining on the serpent, Shashnag, sculpture from the Deoghar, Uttar Pradesh, 5th century. Of these were constructed in the 3rd century BC on the orders of Ashoka for a renouncer who belonged to the Ajivika sect. The tradition evolved through various stages and culminated much later in the 8th century in the carving out of an entire temple. That of Kalishanatha is name of Shiva. A copper-plate inscription records the amusement of the chief sculptor after they completed the temple at Ellora. Oh, how did I make it? Entrance to a cave at Barabar, Bihar, 3rd century BC. Kailashnath Temple, Ellora, Maharashtra. This entire structure is carved out of a single piece of rock. Can we see everything? By now, you have had a glimpse of the rich visual tradition that existed in the past, expressed in brick and stone architecture, sculpture, and painting. We have seen that much has been destroyed and lost over the centuries. Nevertheless, what remained and has been preserved conveys a sense of the vision of the artists, sculptors, masons, and architects who created these spectacular works. Yet, do you always automatically understand what they wanted to convey? Can we ever know what these images mean to people who saw them and venerated them about 2000 years ago? Grappling with the unfamiliar. It will be useful to recall that when 19th century European scholars first saw some of the sculpture of gods and goddesses, they could not understand what these were about. Sometimes they were horrified by the seem to be grotesque. Figures with multiple arms and heads or with combinations of human and animal form. These early scholars tried to make sense of what appeared to be strange images by comparing them with sculpture with which they were familiar, that form of ancient Greece. While they often found early Indian sculpture inferior to the works of Greek artists, they were very excited when they discovered images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that were evidently based on Greek models. These were more often than not found in the northwest in cities such as Taxila and Peshawar, where Indo-Greek rulers had established kingdoms in the 2nd century BC. As these images were closest to the Greek statues the scholars are familiar with, they were considered to be the best example of early Indian art in effect. The scholar adopted a strategy we all frequently use, devising yardsticks derived from the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar. A bodhisattva from Gandhara, note the clothes and the hairstyle. If text and image do not match, consider another problem. We have seen that art historians often draw upon a textual tradition to understand the meaning of sculpture. While this is certainly a far more efficacious strategy, and then comparing Indian images with Greek statues, it is not always easy to use. One of the most sculpture along a huge rock surface in Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu. Clearly, figure 4.30 is a vivid depiction of a story, but which story is it? Art historians have searched through the Puranas to identify it and are sharply divided in their opinions. Some feel that this depicts the descent of the river Ganga from heaven. The natural clefts through the center of the rock surface might represent the river. The story itself is narrated in the Puranas and the epics. Others feel that it represents a story from the Mahabharata, Arjuna doing penance on the river bank in order to acquire arms, pointing to the central figure of an ascetic. Finally, remember that many rituals, religious beliefs, and practices were not recorded in a permanent, visible form as monuments or sculptures or even paintings. This included daily practices as well as those associated with special occasions. Many communities and peoples may not have felt the need for keeping lasting records, even as they may have had vibrant traditions of religious activities and philosophical ideas. In fact, the spectacular instances we have focused on in this chapter are just the tip of the iceberg. Describe any religious activity you have seen. Is it permanently recorded in any form? Comment this. A sculpture in Mahabalipuram Timeline 1. Major religious developments. 1500 to 1000 BCE. Early Vedic tradition. 1000 to 500 BCE. Later Vedic traditions. 6th century. Early Upanishad, Jainism, Buddhism. 3rd century BCE. First Stupas. 2nd century BC onwards, development of Mahayana Buddhism, Vaishnavism, and Shaivism, goddess cults. 3rd century C, earliest temples. Timeline 2, landmarks in the discovery and the preservation of early monuments and sculptures. 19th century, 1814, founding of the Indian Museum, Calcutta. 1834, publication of essay on the architecture of the Hindus by Ram Raja. Cunningham explores the stupa at Sarnath. 1835 to 1842. James Ferguson surveys major archaeological sites. 1851, establishment of Government Museum, Madras. 1854, Alexander Cunningham published Vilashataks, one of the earliest works on Sachi. 1878, Rajendra Lal Mitra, publishers Buddha Gaya, The Heritage of Shakyamuni. 1880, H. Cole appointed Curator of Ancient Monuments. 1888, passing of the Treasure Trove Act, giving the government the right to acquire all objects of archaeological interest. 20th century, 1914, John Marshall and Alfred Foucher published the Monuments of Sachi. 1923, John Marshall publishes the Conservation Manuals. 1955, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru lays the foundation stone of the National Museum, New Delhi. 1989, Sachi declared a World Heritage Site. Answer in 100 to 150 words. A sculpture in Sachi. Write a short essay about 500 words on the following. Map work. Project anyone of the religious tradition discussed in this chapter. Is there any that is practiced in your neighborhood? What are the religious texts used today, and how are they preserved and transmitted? Are images used in worship? If so, are these similar to or different from those described in this chapter? Describe the buildings used for religious activities today, comparing them with early stupas and temples. Comment this. 12. Collect at least 5 pictures of sculpture or painting belonging to different periods and regions on the religious tradition described in this chapter. Remove their captions and show each one to 2 people and ask them to describe what they see. Compare their description and prepare a report on your finding.